And I remember sitting there and finally feeling like I could just be myself. I think eventually I gave up. I gave up on trying to fit in, and I'm so glad that I did because my cousin Tay Hansberry, she told me years ago that I should not dull my shine for anyone. If you can resist that in your youth, or if you can return to that in your adulthood, no one can take that away from you because it's what inherently gives you that spark. It's so frustrating that people can't see ahead of time how many ripple effects there will be once one community is attacked, every other community might be attacked. If you don't have a lot of friends or you feel like you just don't fit in, it's not because you're not worthy or that nobody will ever love you. It's because you haven't found your people yet. Can I tell you how exhausting it is being a bisexual woman and having to convince your own community that you exist?
Hello everyone, I'm Ben Cicchetti and this is Queer Talker with author, educator and content creator Blair Imani. Blair is the creator of the viral web series Smarter in Seconds and a Los Angeles Times best-selling author. Before we get to my conversation with Blair, I have one favor to ask. Wherever you are watching or listening to this episode, hit that subscribe button. It's a small action that makes a massive difference. It'll allow me to grow this podcast and it'll allow me to bring you the best and the queerest episodes every single time. So in advance, thank you. Now to my episode with Blair. Blair, you were nominated to be on Queer Talker by our mutual friend, Christopher Kenner. And when I asked him what one question I should ask you, he literally didn't hesitate. He wanted to hear your thoughts on the role intersectionality has played in your journey and how your experiences as a Black, queer, Muslim woman have shaped how you navigate the world.
Oh my goodness, Chris is always coming in with the hard-hitting questions. Thank you so much for having me. I think that intersectionality has played every single role. I remember when I was in university and I was listening to Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality theory in her 1989 legal essay. And I remember sitting there and finally feeling like I could just be myself. And I think that's the power of words, that's the power of these, frameworks, whether it comes from legal theory or sociology. They can just help us feel like we can be at home within ourselves. Because prior to this, I felt like to be a completely fulfilled person with my, multifacetedness, I had to go to the feminist club, the LGBT club, the Black Student Association, and the Muslim Student Association. And there's only, 5 days in that school week. And so it was very difficult to try to manage all these things. And then I started realizing, I can be my full self in all of these spaces. I don't have to experience myself in an a la carte fashion. And I think as I've grown through the process of, graduating university, creating my platform Smarter in Seconds, I try to demonstrate that in every aspect of the work that I do because it can help others feel, one, that we are all multifaceted. Even if you kind of fit the picture of privilege, you still have a story, you still have a history, and you still need policies that are going to account for your multifacetedness. Instead of feeling like you have to attend several different meetings to be who you are, you can be yourself in every single iteration of your life. And that's what's been so beneficial to me in my journey.
Yeah, it's amazing how just hearing a phrase, as you say, or a word or a description that resonates with you can suddenly unlock something in yourself. And often that happens when we're younger. And I kind of have this theory that to understand a queer person as an adult, we first need to understand them as a young person. So what should I know about you as a child or teenager to understand, the person that sits in front of me today?
There are two things, and I completely share this theory. Something that we talk about on our podcast, Thoughts About Feelings, actually, my friend Michael Threets and I. And there's two things you have to know about me. One is that I was desperately lonely, and I had to constantly determine how to try to fit in. And then I think eventually I gave up. I gave up on trying to fit in. And I'm so glad that I did because my cousin Tay Hansberry, she's an amazing content creator, blogger, leader in the space. And she told me years ago that I should not dull my shine for anyone. And that really helped resonate. And it made me realize that there is a loneliness I feel still sometimes. And I think that's something that everyone shares, whether you have hundreds of friends or just two close friends. You might feel very alone in a space where you're surrounded by people because you have to kind of sit with yourself and be at home with yourself. So that's one thing I had to learn. That's something I tried to pass on to other people, that if you don't have a lot of friends or you feel like you just don't fit in, it's not because you're not worthy or that nobody will ever love you. It's because you haven't found your people yet. And that's how,
Mm.
my friend Chris and Kenna and I became such close friends, because it was like that instant connection of feeling like souls lost in the world. And then you can find your soulmates not just in a romantic partner, but also in your close friends and your family members, etc. The other thing is I love fun facts. So I was this little kid who would walk around with just like a stack of library books. And I thought that my way to being friends with everyone is if I knew a little bit about everything. So if I knew a little bit about everything, if I memorized the encyclopedia, and I was also, I had a chronic illness, I still do. When I was a kid, that meant I was homesick from school often. And so I was like, well, I'll memorize the encyclopedia. I'll memorize the dictionary, which my parents were thrilled about. They're like, great, she's doing her studies. But I remember I came up to this one girl, and I won't say her name, but she was one of the most popular girls in school. And I read her a limerick, and I thought I was going to impress her. And she just kind of looked at me like anyone would look at you if you just ran up and presented a limerick. Um, but I was really proud of myself because I thought I at least made her think. And she said, "Well, Blair, you always have something new to share," and that is true. And now I have a show called Smarter in Seconds where I'm literally
Yeah.
sharing fun facts all the time. And I was just in the car with my sister driving around, and we were listening to some songs from Schoolhouse Rock and just singing those. And I remember like we used to sing those instead of listening to the radio. And that's exactly who I am today. I was someone who was deeply lonely, constantly trying to make friends. And I thought my way of making friends would be to share fun facts. And in a manner, in many different ways, I was right. It just took perhaps a few more decades than anticipated.
It definitely worked out, and it was definitely a trait that clearly stuck with you. But also, it's amazing how at such a young age, the thing that was going to be such a massive part of your life was already present. And it's that idea of, I've spoken to other people on this podcast, of not chasing what's necessarily cool, but what makes you happy and what brings you joy. And clearly, fun facts and sharing that with people is what brought you joy.
And I think that's really what makes you stand out, because if you think about it, the things that you were made fun of for or you were ostracized for are automatically the things that make you stand out, because it's the thing that made other kids and perhaps even adults want to put you back into society's box. And if you can resist that in your youth, or if you can return to that in your adulthood, no one can take that away from you, because it's what inherently gives you that spark. But you can't dull that shine for anyone, as my cousin Tay would say.
I love that. I love that. We talked about kind of those early impressions and those early kind of exposures. Do you remember the first LGBTQ plus person you became aware of, either in kind of real life, in your day-to-day life, or through media, TV, movies, so on and so forth?
Feel like there was three, and I don't really know which one was first. So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to share all three.
Yep. Let's go for it.
So the first was my mom's very close friend, Gabriel, who tragically passed of AIDS when I think probably right as I was born or just before I was born. And all the pictures I saw was like him and my mom with my mom's, she used to be a fashion designer. And so, you kind of have like this classic image of like a gay best friend. And I just felt so sad that I never met him. And my mom would always share with me about how hard it was for him to, kind of relate to his parents. His parents were very, suppressive of his identity. And my mom would always tell me, and I think it was so good. I don't know if she had an inkling that I was queer at that young age, or she was just, kind of being the open-hearted person that she is, that she never wanted anyone to feel like how Gabriel felt. Like, she
Mm.
wanted people to feel seen and heard and be able to share with their families who they are. And so RIP to Gabriel. He was, I've always like kind of visualized him as like my guardian angel looking out for me. And yeah, so number one is Gabriel. And then I remember my Uncle Darren. So Uncle Darren, and it's so funny. Oh my goodness. Well, I'll start with this. So I was making a character on The Sims, and Uncle Darren lived in New Orleans at the time. And so following Hurricane Katrina, we would go down and visit our family in Louisiana more often as we would help them rebuild. And I was making him a character on The Sims. And, in my heteronormative brain, as like, I don't know, a 10-year-old or however old I was I 10? Anyway, however old I was. And so I'm making him a character on The Sims, and I just was like, okay, so making a girlfriend, because not only was that like commonplace in The Sims, but I think it was a recent update that you could, give somebody a same gender partner. And so he was like, oh, well, I prefer men. And I was like, oh, okay. And I just remember being like, oh, well, duh, that's a thing. And then I, remember going through and he's like, and make him chubby. And, I started like making this character, and I just thought that was such a off the cuff,
Yeah.
warm, and like, just appropriate way of presenting to a young person that, hey, not every man wants a wife. Sometimes men want husbands, sometimes men want to be single. Like, and that was just really, I think I remember it because I was a little embarrassed that I assumed. And I always like, tried to not assume other people's, understandings, even as a kid. And then two, it was just like, that's the perfect way to explain things. And then I remember I would try to like help other people understand that, which is very much my vibe today. And then talking about TV, oh my goodness, Marco from Degrassi. Oh, both a
Okay.
blessing and a curse because I remember being like 14, 15, and seeing Marco's story. And the thing that was kind of beat over the head with us in the early 2000s and into the 2010s was if you're not out, you're living a lie. And my mom and I are like this, sometimes too much, sometimes it's TMI. But I just felt like we had this close bond. And if I'm still figuring out what my sexual orientation is, well, that's too bad. I need to figure it out. Now, my understanding today, that's not the case at all. If you never come out, that's totally fine. Doesn't mean you're living a lie. It means you're surviving. It means you're minding your business. But in the moment, I felt so compelled to come out. So I remember I came home from my Catholic school and I like sat my mom very dramatically down on the couch and I was like, Mommy, I am a lesbian. And then she presented to me the idea of bisexuality and was right. And so, but I think Marco was like one of the more like one needed on the one hand, but also, very much through a straight person's lens of what it means to be a queer young person. But I want to share all those different iterations because it helped me to understand that there are so many different ways to be queer, and there are so many places we can get, queer visibility and representation. And sometimes it's people in our family, but sometimes it's people on TV. And through that, it's not like we were trying to emulate those things, but we're trying to see ourselves and try to compare ourselves. And one of the problems was I never saw bisexual representation outside of like, if you recall Tila Tequila, um, role model will be stretching it there. But I think that if I had seen more just like neutral and expansive understandings of bisexuality, which I think we still struggle to see that today in film, I would have, you know, saved myself a lot of biphobia or trying to be a lesbian really hard and failing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. And what I find fascinating about all of those stories and those early experiences is how much they must have shaped you as you grew. Meaning, knowing that your mum had this incredibly close gay friend must have left you with a sense of security when you did start to identify that way. And then also that ease in which your uncle let you know that he was gay gave you that again to think about what you do today. That way of describing things to people and explaining things to people really must have stuck with you.
Oh, 100%. And I almost forgot to share that the last time I saw my Uncle Darren, who's still living his, best life in New Orleans, was actually when I was asked to speak at the 50th anniversary of New York City Pride. And I just happened to be walking around. We were supposed to be backstage, but you can't keep me anywhere. So I was walking around, and then I see this man who looks remarkably familiar, and he was taking a picture with my giant banner because I had done this collaboration with incredible people like Devin Norell and so many other like queer activists. And this person's taking a picture. And then I walk up and I was like, oh, you're taking a picture with my sign. And then I realized it was my Uncle Darren. And it just felt like the most perfect cinematic full circle moment. I'm just getting full body chills thinking about it because it was just like how perfect. Like one of the first people who helped me understand what it meant to be gay, what it meant to be queer. And I was literally getting on stage to talk about that exact story. And for him to be there, I don't think he knew that I was going to be speaking. I think that he was there to see Lady Gaga perform like everyone else.
Okay.
But it was just like, wow, like if you were to write it, somebody might even go, well, that's a little bit on the nose, but that's how my life's been. And yeah, I think that, that kind of ease of understanding, like there was, Uncle Darren who taught me that you could teach anyone anything. But another experience I had in Louisiana was my former mentor, who unfortunately passed away, Miss Sadie Roberts Joseph, who taught me that, a person's ability to understand is not the same as your ability to teach. So if you can't communicate an idea to someone, then you shouldn't judge their inability to understand it. You should judge your ability to or inability to communicate it successfully. And she was talking about this when we were trying to teach primary school students about sharecropping, this really horrific practice during Jim Crow that basically followed slavery and was slavery with more steps and fewer protections in some cases for the folks who were experiencing it. And I remember like I was telling her like these 8-year-olds are not going to understand sharecropping. And she goes, well, if they don't understand, then you didn't communicate it effectively. And that was like the most like astute put down slash call to action. And I was in this like, post university haze where I was like, I know everything. I've gone to college, da da da. And she was like, girl, but it's only, and this is such a paraphrase because she spoke very, elegantly, but she was basically like, if there's no point in knowing things if you can't communicate it to other people. And that has completely driven my show and my work of Smarter in Seconds, of recognizing that if people don't understand it, perhaps I didn't teach it well enough, and perhaps we need to build up to that point. But it is possible, and I shouldn't count people out just because I think I might know more than them. And that's one of the worst traits you can have in an educator, is somebody who thinks that they know more than you and you're incapable of learning, because then what's the point?
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think the idea of being authentic on social media, thinking about your videos, thinking about all the content that you put out, I find really interesting because I think social media naturally lends itself to not being authentic, right? We think about the filters that exist on social media and kind of the precedent that we set for people of to what to expect on social media. But actually, the way you come across on social media is incredibly authentic. When do you think you first felt authentically yourself? And then when do you feel you could bring that authenticity to everything you do, which I think is that kind of next level of authenticity?
I think a huge part of when I felt most authentic was after I converted to Islam. And I don't think it had so much to do with the fact that I decided to be Muslim. I think it was more so that I made a decision for myself that was outside of my parents' purview or approval. My dad was pretty chill when I converted, but just to have my parents be so enthusiastic about me coming out as queer, I don't know if it robbed me of a certain amount of like character development or if it was just,
You wanted the
it's what I
rebellion.
needed. I'm not complaining, but it was a constant struggle to rebel in my household. It really was. Like I remember I pierced my upper cartilage and I showed my mom, and my mom was like, cool, should we go get the other one done, or do you want me to help you do the other one? And I was like, what? Like this, I watched Degrassi. Like this is supposed to be, like skins. Like what?
Yeah.
And then my belly button, and my mom just took me to get my belly button pierced, and she was about to get hers done too. But turns out she has a shallow belly button. Anyway, so it's hard to rebel in my household. And so I felt like I yearned for rebellion for sure. But I think that eventually I had to let go of that, because I was like, okay, well, it looks like my parents are going to love me unconditionally, which is a blessing. But 20-year-old me found that to be a nuisance, which is hilarious and quite privileged if you really think about it. Um, but when I converted to Islam, like it was really, a point of contention with my mom. I think from her perspective, I had gone off to college. I was in my last year at university, and suddenly I am stepping into kind of an organized religious space that she's not familiar with, that doesn't have the best public image, especially in the United States. And she really struggled with that. And so we've been able to like kind of have conversations, and now she's like, one of my fiercest supporters. But it was this point where I was like, okay, wait, who am I outside of my parents? Who am I outside of my relationship with my mom? And I think that it's kind of twofold. On the one hand, I did feel very comfortable with who I was, but it was also one of the times that I was most closeted in my adulthood, where I felt like, okay, well, now that I'm Muslim, I shouldn't talk about being queer. Not necessarily because of the expectation of homophobia, but I just felt like I had too many identities. It had probably been too long since I saw Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw speak that I could remember the intersectionality aspect of it. But I think that that was like, I was kind of pushed out of the nest, and then I got my own job. And I think when I became self-sufficient, that's when I felt like I could be my most full self. And then how that translated to social media in almost a completely different way. I went viral in 2020, and I was, doing talks about intersectionality and anti-racism and anti-oppression. It also happened to be the time where I had the worst breakouts of my life. And so I have the most eyes on me where I could post something and 30,000 people would see it in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And my skin, I still have like the occasional breakout, and I've made peace with that. But I just felt like it was so poetic because it forced me to go on this additional journey of self-love and self-acceptance outside of my identities. Now I had to, kind of contend with my physical body and my skin and things like that. And it was also like, well, the content needs to be made, girl, so you better figure it out. And so I think it was that compulsion to like make the content, be relevant, make the videos. And then people started saying things like, wow, I love how you do it with your acne showing, or I love how you just logged on with your, acne stickers on. And I'm like, I'm just trying to make videos, but it had this like additional layer. And I think that's what happens when you are your authentic self. If you have the protections and ability to do that, you give other people permission to be their selves. And sometimes you have to have somewhat of a departure from what people might expect of you in order to actualize that. I think that even in moments of hardship, you can find a lot of, like I said, character development in who you are. But having a support system around you is everything. And honestly, I was really proud that having all that acne secured me a skincare deal with Face Reality, which I still use today. This is not sponsored, but I'm a big fan. Um, and yeah, I just felt like it was so poetic that, of course, the moment I've achieved my dream as a young California woman of fame and stardom, I have the worst acne of my life, but it was good for the plot.
And we've obviously touched on Smarter in Seconds a couple of times, and I'm obsessed with the series, and it's so easy to digest it. It really does. So it breaks down really important topics and educates people on the kind of critical nature of them. Where did the idea come from, and how has it evolved as time has gone on?
Oh boy, has it evolved and for the better, I think. But it came out of, after I went viral in 2020, a dear friend of mine, Courtney Quinn, who goes online as Color Me Courtney, connected me with her agency at the time, which I'm still with. And they had so many different things like, Meta would come to these content creator platforms and agencies and say, hey, we're launching threads, we're launching Reels. And at the time it was Reels. And they were giving us this like master class in how to use Reels, how to maximize it. And everybody's like, oh, that's great. I'll do a lip sync video. I'll do what I do on TikTok. I wasn't really on TikTok at the time. And then you had all the other people who were like, well, I'll do makeup tutorials and stuff like that. And I'm thinking like, oh my God, I'm going to embarrass myself. Like, I need to stay true to who I am, but I don't feel confident dancing. I don't feel confident doing my makeup on camera. And then I thought, oh my gosh, why didn't I just do what I've always done, which is the fun facts thing? And so I was like, okay. And I think some of the first episodes were about like, do you say Black or African American, and explaining the difference between race and ethnicity and personal preference, and what are pronouns, and how do you navigate if you get somebody's pronouns wrong, or you make a mistake, or you misgender someone, and navigating, not over apologizing but trying to be accountable. The best thing that Courtney Quinn did, and God bless her for it, was give it the title. I was going to call it Quarter Minute Lessons. Two things: never make people do math in the title, and then the other thing is that Instagram Reels, it went from 15 seconds to 30 seconds to a minute to 90 seconds to 3 minutes now, and I'll probably grow it from there. And so if it was Quarter Minute Lessons, I would have had to change the title at least 4 times. Now that's terrible for brand recognition. But Smarter in Seconds, it's catchy, it gets to the point, and now it is trademark registered. And then I reached out, or actually, an amazing non-binary, very talented songwriter and singer named Katie Cronin reached out to me to create the audio logo, the jingle that goes with it that so many people know now. And it's just been a whirlwind. So it evolved with branding, with collaboration. My partner, my husband, he studied performance studies. And so he was also very helpful with, okay, well, you've had this format like, locked down. I've been presenting in front of like this massive wooden wardrobe, and it was very kind of formulaic, and I liked the rhythm. I definitely love formulas. It helps keep my ADHD in track and in a
Right.
container. But he was like, well, why not add sketches? Why not go onto sets, adding green screens? And so there's been so many different iterations. And now I kind of mix them in together. So I would say we're probably in like season 4 of Smarter in Seconds, very unofficial seasons. And I've started collaborating with people. Everyone who I collaborate with, I try to compensate, because even though not every Smarter in Seconds is sponsored, I would love that. But they help me make money. And it's really important to me to compensate people for helping me grow my platform and my visibility. And I've been so proud. I recently just reposted a Smarter in Seconds about Down syndrome for International Down Syndrome Awareness Day. And I was able to work with 3 amazing women who all have Down syndrome to do that education. And I think it's the twofold education of learning about Down syndrome on the one hand, but then also helping people to understand that people with Down syndrome can also be the ones to be the educators about it. And we don't always have to speak on behalf of people with disabilities, that we can speak alongside them and with them. So it's just been an awesome blessing, and just so on point. And, sometimes I'll connect with people who knew me from high school or from elementary school, and they're like, oh, yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah, I just think it's such an important, actually, and critical resource for people to have, because I think we do live in such a complex world, and but people, our attention spans are less. We want to digest information incredibly quickly, and you're dealing with such important topics that being able to describe that to someone in seconds, as you say, it really helps people to, I think, navigate the world better, and to they may have questions they don't feel comfortable going to somebody and asking those questions, but being able to find your resources and digest that information naturally gives them that ability to learn without potentially feeling like, because no one wants to make a mistake, right? You talked about, no one wants to say the wrong pronouns, and then what do you do when you do say the wrong pronouns, as an example. So to have someone there and a resource they can go to learn this information, it almost gives them a safe space, if that makes sense.
Really hope so. And I get quite frustrated with other folks in the comments who'll be quick to admonish someone for asking a vulnerable question. Someone said, I think this is a recent video I had done about feminism, and the question was about women who internalize patriarchy. And it's a very good question. You see all of the negative side effects of patriarchy and consequences, and then you see women who vote in a direction where it reinforces the patriarchy. And this person had a great question. They're like, hey, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, not trying to be stupid, just trying to have a conversation. And then somebody was like, well, you shouldn't wait for a woman to teach you about it on the internet. And I'm like, hi, hello, the woman who has volunteered to teach on the internet. And then they like backed way up and were like, I'm so sorry, my bad. And then they were like, the other person was like, thanks for having my back. But I'm like, this is a classroom, right? So we don't shut people down for having these questions, because that's what this space is for. And I really try to assume neutral intention with every question that is asked, because sometimes I'll get a question and it'll be like directed at me or be negative. Like one of the questions I'll often get, especially when I was doing my videos about race versus ethnicity versus nationality, is about my racial identity, because I am a lighter skinned Black woman. And for a lot of people who might have a one-dimensional understanding of Blackness, or might genuinely not have seen somebody of my complexion who's Black, or didn't realize, they'll ask me like, okay, wait, you described yourself as Black, but your skin's not like darker, explain. And that does trigger a little bit of the part of me that was, a kid and stuff. But I also have to be like, okay, well, this is the first time a person might know that. And that's what I try to do with every episode, is give it to somebody as if they never knew it before. I try to use limited acronyms. Even a video recently that I did about libraries, like helping people to understand all the services that libraries provide and why they're so attacked by fascist and authoritarian regimes. And it's really such a joy. And what I love most about the shorter format is that even when my parents are busy or my partner's busy, I can be like, well, it's only 90 seconds. Well, why don't you just watch it for 90 seconds? Mind you, it'll be like the seventh video I've tried to show them today. But I think the short format does need that moment. And I think on the one hand, I do see a lot of folks who are very frustrated with the shorter attention spans. But I think that you have to, this is a very overstimulating world, and we have to fight for people's attention. If I have something that I feel like is worth communicating, I try to do so in a way where I am, being responsible and accounting for, they have a busy day. I can't assume that they have all the time in the world. I'm going to hope they have at least 3 minutes or 90 seconds and give it to them in that amount of time. And I'm going to keep it engaging throughout. And then it's fun for me too, because I have ADHD. And if I get bored editing my video, I know people are going to get bored watching it.
That's super interesting. That's like an interesting kind of measure to put on yourself. Is, if I'm gonna, my attention can keep this to this video, then hopefully everyone else's will. And you've touched on obviously being bisexual, and something that I often hear from bisexual friends or bisexual acquaintances is that depending on the relationship that they're in, their queerness can feel less visible, both personally and kind of within the broader LGBTQ plus community. You touched on the fact that we don't have as much bisexual representation in TV and in movie. Is that something you've experienced? And if so, how do you navigate that while staying connected to the queer part of your identity?
I'm so glad you asked this, because it is definitely a recurring theme. And as after I got married and, people see me and my husband and they make assumptions, I felt like I literally had to make a video that was like, hey, so I
Mm.
got married, but I'm still bisexual. And it's frustrating to have to make one, but then the reactions I got, like, can I tell you how many queer events I started getting invited to again after I started making that video of being like, hey, you know how I've been doing all this queer advocacy the whole time? Well, I also benefit from that as a bisexual woman, and helping people to understand, because I think that there's two things that emerge. when you talk about the visibility of bisexuals is sometimes there is the privilege aspect of it of being able to quote unquote hide. But then you have to think if that hiding is coming at the expense of you being able to be your full self and get the care that you might need. A great example was MPX. Like when that virus was going around, there were a lot of bisexual people of all genders who were having a hard time being able to get the vaccine to protect themselves because there are vaccine shortages, but also because there were untrained medical staff who didn't realize that bisexuality is real and that, yes, if you're a married person and you're married to a person of one gender, you might need MPX because of your, contact with somebody else. So people are polyamorous and like we just need care and attention. And so I think that it's been a journey for myself to like really be affirmed in it. But it's also one of those things where it is such a part of who I am. And even in moments where the biphobia and the bi erasure kind of infiltrate into my own mind, and I'm like, well, I don't really need to talk about being bisexual anymore. It's still just very much part of who I am, whether I'm talking about previous partners or, sharing experiences. And I think that's, kind of a constant battle. Recently, I've started kind of a drama on threads because I was talking about how many straight women talk about having a girl crush and whether they might
Mm,
consider that they're
yeah.
bisexual. I wasn't saying that if you're a straight woman and you have a girl crush, then you're automatically bisexual. I was saying, I wonder why straight women who have a lot of girl crushes might not consider that they're bisexual. And I think that just the fact that my brain works that way is more evidence of the bisexuality. But who you are doesn't change or go away based on your relationship status. And I think that in our world where we build so much of our identities around who we're dating or who we're married to, especially for women, it can feel like this struggle of fighting that socialization of actually I am a whole person. I think that women suffer that kind of, self-identity death through marriage, often through having children. It's no longer you're a person, you're a mother, no longer you're a person, you're a wife.
Right.
And so I think it all layers together. And it's always important to be yourself because if you're not yourself, then and this is something Chris kind of taught me, you have to be yourself at full volume. Otherwise, other people can't find you and they might not realize that they can be themselves too. And so it's like that more like that higher calling. But I think it also like, I just want people to feel comfortable with who they are. And if they need to see me doing it, that's great. But I also can't stop being myself just because I'm in a different era or phase of who I am. And that said, bisexuality is not a phase. But relationships might be. And that's why we have to talk about the immutable nature of who we are and how our understandings might change, but who you are as an inherent, like as a person, doesn't change. And the way we speak to that is so important and so sacred. And so it's kind of this constant flow. But I remember one bisexual visibility day, I think it might have even been last year. I was so over it. I was like, okay, bisexual visibility day. Can I tell you how exhausting it is being a bisexual woman and having to convince your own community that you exist? So
Yeah.
I think it's not just this toxic positivity of it, but it's also talking about the difficulties too.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you touched on the loudness and needing to be loud. So it's inevitable that we will touch on the current political climate in the US, and the impact of leadership or lack thereof and rhetoric on marginalized communities. So, let's drop the Trump bomb and talk about Trump a little bit. How have Trump's and his government's policies and public statements, which seems to be almost the bigger part of his current term, affected you personally as well as the communities that you work and advocate for?
Well, I'll start kind of outside of the community, like, the community outside of myself, because with Trump's executive orders and bold and hateful rhetoric, it's giving license and permission to people to be openly anti-immigrant, to be
Yeah,
openly anti-trans. I've
yeah.
even seen some of the conservative talking heads themselves, a lot of women, be transvestigated, where people assume that they're transgender because they might not conform to the Euro colonial patriarchal standard of what a woman should be and how she should express herself and speak. And so you're seeing how like pervasive it is. And I know we've seen that, especially in the UK, seeing people who've been trying to shut down hormone replacement therapy only for it to not only impact transgender folks, but for it to also impact menopausal cisgender women and men who want to get, testosterone boosts as they get older in age. And so it's it's so frustrating that people can't see ahead of time how many ripple effects there will be once one community is attacked, every other community might be attacked. Right now, we're having attacks on free speech. How it's affecting me personally is having to be a lot more careful about what I say online. And on the one hand, people have been like, well, say it anyway. Well, girl, okay, I've been arrested at protests before. My husband and I sued the city of Baton Rouge after we were arrested in 2016, and it took several years for us to navigate that legal process and, get ourselves protected. So I have to be on high alert. Also having multiple identities that come under fire as a Black, queer, Muslim woman. And so it's trying to remain strong through that, have a brave face, but sometimes I have to get online and I have to crash out too, and I have to say, none of us elected this Elon Musk guy, and yet he's running our government. Um, you know, talking about all these different things, like how they're trying to cut libraries and museums, even though the 125,000 libraries in the US that serve over 1.2 billion people only account for 0.003% of the federal budget, and yet they're coming under fire. Meanwhile, the person who's making those cuts is one of the biggest welfare queens in the United States, getting all of these different handouts for his, multi-billion-dollar tech companies. And so, and that's Elon Musk that I'm talking about there. And so it's like, it's frustrating to see and frustrating to stay hopeful, but there's, so much action and so much to be done. And so that's where I try to focus my attention. But sometimes you really just have to sit down and go, shit, this is bad. And then also dealing with the crisis of the, wildfires in Southern California that's directly affected my family, happening right at the top of the year. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of plates that I'm spinning all at the same time and trying to educate people. But my biggest coping mechanism is my show Smarter in Seconds, because I can say, okay, well, here's what we're going to learn about next. Okay, well, here's what we're
Yeah.
going to do next. But I've been really impressed that on the one hand, I know that a lot of my peers in the educational space have had a hard time trying to stay booked and, trying to appeal to different companies and constantly having to pivot. But I was just booked in a very small town of Gunnison, Colorado, to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and intersectionality. And I plan to be making a video soon talking about that. Like, even though there's all these attacks, we should know that there are still small towns out there who want to hear about this. There are still places in middle America who care about these things. And that we can't obey in advance, right? We can't relent to fascists before they even try to, put the foot down on us. And we have to protect each other. And there actually have been a lot of policies that he's tried to do that have been fought in the court successfully. And so just trying to look at everything, trying to take a deep breath, and then make it to the gym at the same time, it's just too much. So, um, but I think that the biggest thing in the community is that people are feeling very scared, rightfully so, because they're thinking about the trans youth who might not feel they have a reason to stick around, or the adults who are fearing for their marriage, people who are legal residents of the US getting deported. So uh, I try to keep it optimistic, but I'm also very, very understanding of how grave it is. Not just appears to be, but is.
Yeah, it does feel incredibly scary. Even as a Brit who, can somewhat divorce myself from the situation, I can try and kind of ignore some of the messages coming through. But, I recently traveled to the US for work, and it was the first time I traveled to the US and felt slightly uncomfortable. And I was going to New York City, which I appreciate is somewhat of a bubble for that situation, but I still felt slightly less safe. And I'm a white cis man. Most would describe quote unquote as straight passing. So I appreciate that I actually have a huge amount of privilege in that situation. But it was the first time I had come to the US where I felt nervous and I felt slightly less comfortable. And then a similar experience was last year. I went on holiday to the Dominican Republic, where obviously there's a lot of Americans, and I saw multiple MAGA hats. And it was the first time I felt, again, I felt unsafe, and I felt slightly, my dad's American, so I've always felt so comfortable around Americans. But I suddenly became aware of, this isn't guaranteed that I'm safe to be around them, or that they are accepting of me, or they are loving of me. And therefore, it is strange how much of a shift we've seen as Brits looking at America. So I can only imagine how that shift has felt being there.
I feel like it's this grand disillusionment that a lot of people are having with the idea of America. And it's so frustrating because you have the MAGA hats, which is Make America Great Again, and yet they're dismantling everything that made America great. I think
Yeah.
that on the surface, the whole world, even if they've been in conflict with us or, kind of the victims of, US imperialism have looked at the US as this place where anything is possible, where you can do
100%.
anything. And then you have all these personal freedoms being attacked. And it's mind-boggling because you have the same people who are saying family values and they have however many wives, but they're not protecting the other people who have these experiences that might have more diverse families while also not being a typical family to begin with. And I think that it's this pulling back of this facade. And so you have people like my husband, who I think were already very disillusioned as, like, a Black man in the United States, who kind of grew up getting surveilled as a Muslim youth. And so it's like, I think a lot of people are catching up to where a lot of the country has felt. But I think it's this on the world stage, just seeing how unhinged and disorganized and hateful it um, is is troubling. And so I've actually found that a lot of non-Americans are struggling with it even more than Americans are. So I think a lot of us, it's like better the devil you know. And for a lot of folks, they don't know the devil that sometimes the United States can be to its own people, and so they're seeing kind of all of this glitz and glamour flake away, and they're seeing kind of like the grim, kind of backdrop, and that's really jarring for a lot of folks. And I think it's also because so many folks in the States are came to the US by choice, people who immigrated here, or who became refugees here. Not that the process of being a refugee is by any means a choice, but thinking that America is going to be this better place for them. And now seeing almost everything that we hold dear, freedom of speech, personal freedoms, being attacked, even our democracy, with Trump talking about taking a third term now. And then it's also feeling like nothing is happening while there have been huge resistance movements, and we have to speak to that, but they're being suppressed in the algorithm, in the media. So it's a lot. And anyone who's feeling it's a lot, you're just paying attention. And I don't know if I have anything to say that's going to make people feel better, but I would recommend signing up for the ACLU and the Legal Defense Fund's newsletters, because they are stopping or trying to stop this tyrannical push and this authoritarianism at every point possible. Um, but it's bad.
Yeah, and I think in one of your Smarter in Seconds videos, you talked about something that actually just really resonated with me, because we are this social media generation where we are constantly on our social media feeds. And you talked about the power of distraction and exhaustion, and how we're constantly being swept up in this barrage of news, of executive orders that potentially are designed to keep us from focusing on what really matters. Can you break that down for our listeners and share, I guess, any advice you have on how do we cut through the noise, or should we cut through the noise and stay focused on what's actually important and in front of us?
I mean, it's deeply difficult to do, whether or not you have neurodiversity or neurodivergence like I do with ADHD, where you struggle to focus in general. But what I was speaking to is, I think it was like the day after Trump took office, so many people were like, oh my gosh, you're following Trump? What the heck? Not the biggest thing. One, there was like
Yeah.
this whole glitch on Instagram where if you were following the former president, you were following
Yeah.
this current president, da, da, da. Not as important as the attacks on our trans family members, not as important on the immigration and deportations, but it's all expressions of authoritarianism. So I think it's good to have a certain amount of awareness to it. But where I see at that moment, I saw so much people having this outrage that was like, I just believe that we have so much attention. Everybody has their own, amount of attention that they can focus. Otherwise, it gets too spread thin and you're kind of like half-assed caring about things. Awareness is fine. Bearing witness is so important so we can, like, be present. But in terms of what kind of actions we can take, I was talking about how important it is to specialize, because there will be people who are deeply focused on the climate, are deeply focused on the national parks and whether or not national parks are getting deforested and how many, national parks workers are getting fired. Awesome. I need them to focus on that. I need them to also be intersectional, right? So they should also care about the queer and trans and Black national parks workers. But I'm not going to be shading them if they're not paying attention to attacks on gay marriage, because we have folks who are also specializing and focusing on that. And so it's more of looking at ourselves as a team instead of feeling like we have to be the savior of the day and that
Mm.
we're Superman and we have to be the ones to fight every single villain. We can team up and be more like the Justice League, and that is such an extended metaphor, but it's like thinking about all the different ways we can show up and link together and show up in solidarity. Because I think that's much more effective. That's what's worked historically. That's what worked with the civil rights movement. You had people who are focused on, desegregating schools. You had people who were focused on desegregating public transportation, like the bus boycotts. You had people who were focused on women's rights. There was a lack of intersectionality, and I think that's a lot of the criticism we can look back historically. But we have so much technology now that's helping us share and stay the most up to date on the work that's happening. Instead of trying to shame people for not knowing something, we can just be there to share. I saw someone recently who I got into a bit of a row with online. But I think this person was saying something like, "Oh, Americans don't understand the difference between a state ID and proof of citizenship." And I'm like, "Yeah, they don't. So why don't we spend that time explaining it instead of being mad that people don't understand?" Now, on the one hand, was I tone policing the person? Yeah, a little bit. Was I also just like posting that tweet at maybe like 10 o'clock and was not really thinking about this person and their feelings? My bad also. But I explained the difference. A state ID, that's something like your driver's license. It basically uses your face check to make sure the same face is on the document and that your address is the same. Awesome. What they're trying to push to do, especially for voting, is to make you have your birth certificate or your naturalization papers or your passport in order to be able to vote. But we also know in the US that passports are expensive. Not many Americans have passports. A lot of people don't have the funds to travel outside the country or desire to travel outside the country because we're a huge country and you can go to so many different locales. And so how that's going to impact voting rights is yet to be seen and quite devastating. But there are organizations, again, like the Legal Defense Fund, who are fighting it. But I was just saying, like, the way that we show up for one another in this time is to help cross-pollinate and to help educate for those who don't know, instead of being frustrated. Oh, no one cares. No one's taking action. Instead, to try to have a curiosity to say, who is taking action? Who
Yeah.
does care? How can I show up for those people? How can I help out with that? Because it requires a bit of humility, and I think that's healthy and important, especially as we face these attacks as a country and as a democracy. But it's also what's going to keep us safe, and I think it's a much better way to operate. But progressives have gotten a lot of sometimes earned flack for this elitism, and I think we have to surrender that if we're going to be there for each other, because we can't feel superior that someone knows something and another person doesn't, because education is going to be so precious, particularly as they attack libraries, particularly as they attack schools and curriculum. So I get quite up in arms about it, but I try to be encouraging. I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad. You should be proud that you know things, but you should also perhaps even be prouder that you can help other people come along with you.
Yeah, I agree. And obviously, one of the things we're seeing happen is words like woke, DEI are being weaponized against us, turned into or twisted into kind of these negative phrases when at their core, what they're about is caring and they're about progression. So, how do we push back against that negativity and that narrative and reclaim the values of actually what we mean when we say woke and DEI?
I mean, for me, so before I did Smarter in Seconds and had a whole social media platform, I worked at Planned Parenthood, and a huge part of my job was message research and message trainings. And so we would have this amazing data from people in the Deep South who were openly and boldly against abortion, and we would try to determine what can we say to these folks to help them understand the necessity of abortion as a medical service. And we would see great results. We would have to come back to ideas of, well, the government shouldn't be in my business. And if I make a decision between me and my doctor and perhaps, my religious head or my family, and we would see just giving more picture and color to it is beneficial. So I saw time and time again, the more people knew about what abortion is and birth control and what Planned Parenthood services are provided and the lack of care that many people experience, the better it was. And we're even seeing this in places like Georgia, where they have a horrific 6-week ban, I believe, on abortion, which has impacted people who are not just seeking abortion, but for people who maybe have had a miscarriage and can't get the care that they
Right.
need. So more education is better. So the way I've been pushing back on the conversations around woke and DEI is to teach people what those words mean and where they came from. I think once folks realize, oh, DEI is actually something that's been around for 50 years, and there's only been real hysteria around it since 2020 with following the murder of George Floyd and people having an uprise and desire for more conversations about race and racism. That's the first time I would say Trump learned what DEI was, specifically how he talks about it, and to help people understand that actually DEI is a fair process, because the alternative to it is nepotism, is is white supremacy and resegregation. And so helping people to better understand that and doing it in a way where I'm not admonishing them for not knowing, but inviting them to have a conversation or the conversation on woke and helping people to understand that this is a term that's been part of the Black American vocabulary for decades, going into the early 20th century, and how it was just a term to talk about being aware of social unrest, of political oppression, of racism, and that the need to be woke was the need to be awake to those facts. And I think that sometimes when a term is attacked, DEI, woke, etc., you have people who are like, okay, well, let's throw that out in the bin. They've taken it. But I feel like we
Yeah.
should fight back because these are
Yeah.
good terms. And I think that the queer community has done an amazing job with that. Queer used to be a term, a slur, and some people I'm sure still use it that way. But a lot of us have reclaimed this as a term of pride to say, no, I don't fit in. I'm not straight. I'm not cisgender. And I don't need to be to deserve your humanity. And I think that that's what I've tried to do with the word woke, that yes, I am proudly woke. But I think that there is this bit of shame, but there are always going to be hot button words. And I think that the right is unfortunately extremely good at taking a word, digging it down into the depths of the earth and making no one want to use it. They're very good at branding. But if we can start to uncover why they're trying to do that, perhaps we can get to a better place. And so I made a video about diversity, equity, and inclusion back in, I think, July. And it got maybe like 200,000 views. People were interested in it. It's pretty good for me. I reposted it, I think, at the beginning of the year. It got 1 million views because people are like, oh my gosh. So I think, people have the appetite to learn. But as we've seen with major corporations who have tried to step back from DEI, on the one hand, you have places like Target that have tried to entice LGBTQ plus people to spend our rainbow and trans flag dollars at Target for Pride Month, and the Black community and Latino community to spend their, hard-earned dollars with Target. Now you see Target losing, I think, some figure of billions in value because people
Yeah.
are boycotting. They're like, oh, you can't take my money. You can't be a fair weather friend because I'll be a fair weather consumer.
Yeah.
And so I think hitting people in their wallet is another way that we can fight back against these people turning their backs on what is essentially and is fairness and awareness of white supremacy, of oppression, and really making it clear that if somebody doesn't want you to be woke, they want you to not be aware of their nefarious activity. And so I think the more I can say that out loud and help people develop that, kind of message to share, the better.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the Target example is an interesting one. There was a 4-week period in February, soon after they announced they were rolling back their D&I activities. I think they lost 5 million customers in that time. And at the same time, Costco, who had stood by their D&I activities, had gained 7 million customers. So it does show there is that argument that your wallet might be louder than your voice sometimes.
Sometimes, yes, especially if capitalism is the way that they're trying to communicate those things. But more good guy Costco examples. After the Eaton fire here in Altadena, they have been coming and replacing mattresses. They have been really supportive to the community. And even my little niece, she's 5 years old, and she would always say, "Oh, Blair, can we go to Target? Can we go to Target?" And I had to explain to her why we don't go to Target anymore. And so now she's like, "Can we go to Costco?" And so they're, you think about companies like Levi's Jeans that used to make action figures for little kids to try to get them to be lifelong Levi's customers. You have a whole generation of kids who are seeing their parents not want to buy from Target because they have had this pendulum swing. And I think that your wallet is a huge way that we vote. And even where you place your attention, I see so much outrage around Tesla, rightfully so, as a way to try to get back Elon Musk. But I don't sometimes see that same energy when it comes to the platforms like X or the AI, slop generator Grok. So I think that the more awareness people can have about shifting where they spend their time, and that our power as consumers, like we might not have value to a lot of these institutions as people, but we do have value to them as dollar signs and as engagement. And if we can be selective about that, then we have our power. And that is grim, but it's true.
Yeah, I completely agree. And look, we started this conversation talking about your younger self. So let's revisit them. If you could give your younger self one piece of advice, what would it be? And would it be different if I said, what advice would you give to a young queer person today?
Ooh. Hmm. So I often, have these little quips and quotes that I share. And I think the one I would share for a queer young person today is that there are going to be so many forces in the world that try to make you forget yourself, but you do know who you are. You've just been taught to doubt yourself, and you might be being taught to doubt yourself right now, but there are so many people out there who love you, who support you, who are rooting for you, myself included. And if that's what you need to keep doing it, to keep living, then I hope you carry that with you. The advice I think I would give to myself is um, I think that I, in hindsight, maybe had more opportunities for friendship than I was aware, and I was so afraid of rejection. And so I think I would give myself the advice that rejection is part of the process of making friends because not everyone will be your friend, and that's not because you're unlovable, but it's because not everyone is available to be your friend. You know, you don't get along with everyone, and that's okay, but that doesn't mean that the fear of rejection should stop you from trying. Because I know so many people now in my adulthood who was like, well, Blair, I would have invited you. I just, I would have. And so sometimes you have to be the one to extend that olive branch, and it's difficult, but it's worth it. And I think that's the advice I'd give myself.
That. I love that. I think those are both amazing pieces of advice for yourself, but also just in general for people. We will end with our rapid fire questions.
My favorite
And
type of questions.
there we go. Yeah, you should be the pro at this for sure. And in the queer community, we love a good icon, especially a powerhouse woman. Think Gaga, Whitney, Cher, Britney. Who is your ultimate go-to queen?
Think it's Audre Lorde because we would not have the conversations of self-care that we have today if it were not for Audre Lorde, a Black queer woman, mother, warrior, poet who was fighting cancer and had to have conversations about how she's not meant to, in the context of the United States, survive cancer because that's not the world we have. And so she's going to speak truth to power. And now when I see people talk about self-care and they talk about how much candles cost instead of talking about how we have to take care of ourselves and take care of our community, I think we need more Audre Lorde. So she is the queen.
Love that. What is your favorite queer TV show, movie, musical, or book?
Ooh, okay. I just watched Operation Mincemeat on Broadway, which I think came from the West End. And I didn't anticipate it being a queer story, but they definitely made it one. And I think that's my favorite right now, definitely thinking contemporarily. But I love when queer storylines are woven into the fabric of places that you might not see, whether it's somewhere like Downton Abbey, different period pieces. But I think Operation Mincemeat will definitely be the more recent one because I just saw it and it's quite good.
I love that. I'll have to check if it's on the West End at the moment or if it comes back because I missed that. If you had to lip sync for your life, what song would you choose?
Easy peasy. I'm still standing by Elton John. Final answer. I'm a huge Elton
Yes.
John fanatic. I think it's been so beautiful how he's been able to step into his truth as somebody who had the threat of losing his entire career for that previously, who went through addiction, and who is a style icon as well. So 100% I'm still standing by Elton John because that's what I sing at karaoke.
I love that. Amazing choice. What is one phrase or idea that people always misunderstand that you can correct in a smarter in seconds?
Intersectionality theory. A lot of people think that it's just naming your different identities, which is part of it. But importantly, it's how our different identities connect to different systems of oppression and how those different systems can give us power through privilege or can suppress our power or oppress us through oppression. So it's the second part. Yes, it's your identities, but it's also how it connects to our different systems and whether that privileges you or oppresses you. So there you go. Smarter in seconds.
Amazing. I'm a history buff, and I love the phrase that if you don't understand history, you're doomed to repeat it. So, what's one piece of history that you wish people just knew better so we're not doomed to repeat it?
I fear we're repeating it now, but I think the lavender scare is a great example. You know, there was so much propaganda generated across the Western world, particularly in the United States, that was, you'd have places where they would accept someone for being trans, like in rural, deep Florida. There's a woman named Georgia Black who was openly accepted by her community, I believe, in 1951. And then you have the U.S. come in largely through the military and create this propaganda to make people fear gender nonconforming folks, to make people fear LGBTQ plus folks. And it wasn't until then that we start to see the homophobia. So I think that the lavender scare is an excellent example of how taught homophobia and hate is and how unnatural that is to the natural human spirit. And I fear that we're repeating it now because we see people repeating horrible talking points about trans folks adults playing sports or simply existing. But I think it's an important period of time to understand because we can also see how civil rights organizations help to fight back, and we can fight
Yeah.
back too.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. If you could have one drink with any queer person, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Oh, that's a good one. Okay. On the grounds that perhaps Abraham Lincoln was queer.
Yeah.
Abraham Lincoln, because some of these quotes we see from Abraham Lincoln position him as a super freedom fighter, and the other ones make him seem pretty racist. So
Yeah.
I'd want to get down into it, and I love having a little bit of an adversarial drink moment, whether I'm at the airport or in a small town. But I think having catching up with old Abe would be quite interesting.
Yeah, I think that would be fascinating. So you were obviously nominated to be on this podcast by our friend Christopher Kenner. So who would you nominate for me to have on the podcast? And what one question would you want me to ask them?
Oh, okay. I think I'd have to go with my friend who actually is in the UK and just became an OBE, which is Lauren Rowell's Paralympian, I believe, gold medal winner, and just an amazing person. And I think my question for Lauren would be, women in sport is a huge part of the conversation, particularly as it's being turned against the LGBTQ plus community. And as an openly LGBTQ plus woman who has a family and a partner who's also an athlete, how are you navigating the intersectionality of that, especially as so many people look up to you, especially as you are, gaining these recognitions by the UK in a context where so many countries are turning against things like gay marriage and families. I'd be so curious to know that. And I don't know. I just hope Lauren's doing well, making everyone very proud, especially in the UK.
Love that. We will definitely reach out, try and get them on podcast, and I will definitely ask them those questions. Blair, thank you so much for being on the podcast with me today. But more importantly, just thank you for the work you're doing. As I said earlier, I think the concept of the smarter in seconds is just so important in a world where we can feel more divided and you can feel more nervous to ask those questions. Having someone like you where people can go to learn more, to educate themselves, and hopefully we can just make the world better by eradicating some of the ignorance that I think fuels a lot of the hate we see. So thank you so much for being on the podcast, and thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast, Queer Talker. And I think you're right. I think that if we can teach more people, then we'll have less hate. And if we have less hate, then we can all thrive. Inshallah.
Queer Talker, walls and walls.